So, folks, I've got with me a very interesting individual who I've been hounding since the first times that I went to harvest in Fredericton, New Brunswick. This man is well known. He's world traveled, and his name is simply David Braid. He's made inroads for a lot of musicians, made friends, and collaborated, composed, and he's very active on YouTube, which I congratulate him on. So, David, tell us when did you first start? Or actually, I might want to ask this question: where were you born, and where are you living now? We'll start with that.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, so I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, and I lived there until I went to university, and then I moved to Toronto, and that would have been in 1994. I did an undergraduate degree at U of T, and then I basically stayed in Toronto ever since.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you're pretty much central to Canada and the world.
Yeah,
Um,
I realized some years ago, when the majority of opinions suggested that it's impossible to make a living as a performer of, niche music,
hmm,
that the thought came to me that if it's difficult because one city just doesn't offer enough, then maybe there's a logic in trying to become local to multiple cities. So this wasn't the reason why I started, touring in different countries,
uh-huh.
but what a happy result of doing that is that I feel like I've made inroads and good contacts with like-minded musicians in different countries in the world, and I feel sort of local to some other cities. So the combined amount of work um, in all those places seems to piece together enough to make a living and stay inspired and creative as a composer, firstly, and of course as a pianist as well.
Okay. When did you first had, uh, I want to say inkling, it's more than that. When did you actually start playing music?
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's not a typical um, story, I suppose. I guess I hear from my mother and my older brother that, when I was very young, I guess I was 2 years old, my older brother was taking piano lessons, and whenever he would play the piano, apparently I would crawl over to the piano and just like watch him and sit there with my head against the instrument,
Okay.
and and I think maybe it's relevant to mention I had really bad eyesight from birth. So I don't know if that heightened my sensitivity to sound and music. I'm not sure. But anyways, my older brother saw that I was interested. So I guess when I was, I guess when I was 3, he started teaching me to read the treble clef. So in fact, I learned to read music before. Well, I mean, I learned to read notes on a treble clef before I could read words. And
Mhm.
so my mother saw that I guess he's interested in this. I wouldn't say that I come from a musical family per se. Although when I sort of consider my extended family, I think there's all the necessary parts in order to, build the DNA that would be appropriate for a musician and composer. But anyway, so my mother took me to my older brother's piano teacher when I was 3 and a half. And I completely remember my first lesson. I was, obviously very small. So I was sitting up on a lot of pillows to reach the keys. And I remember the pillows were unsteady, so I was trying not to fall off. And I remember the teacher was testing me on some things. And I suppose I passed her test. And I started taking lessons from that age. But this teacher wasn't a pianist, wasn't a professional musician. Um, she was just sort of a neighborhood music teacher who would take a few students, like I suppose at the end of her workday. And I have to say that it was not a positive experience at all. She was part of the old generation of teaching, by intimidation, violence, by force, by today's terms, it would be, she'd probably be in jail if she was teaching that way. I got hit a lot in my lessons, and
Oof.
she's just a really angry person. And so what happened was that I associated my time with her with the experience of learning music. Despite that, I don't really remember this too well, but apparently I was excelling at it, and but I was like literally getting sick every Tuesday afternoon, because I knew I had to go to her house that evening for a lesson, and my
Okay.
brother would go first, so she would like beat him and scream at him, while I'm like sitting watching, cartoons with no sound. It was like Fables of the Green Forest. I'm watching these happy birds, animals like chirp, chirp. Meanwhile, my brother's getting destroyed by this lady, and I know my turn is next, So that was that. I can still feel that, to this day. So finally, my parents, who probably liked us going to music lessons just for discipline reasons.
Mhm.
They finally said, okay, fine. We wasted all our money on your music lessons. You don't have to go anymore, and that was it. So I stopped around, I guess, 10, 11. And by that point, I had gone through a bunch of the Royal Conservatory. I guess I was playing okay, and but the whole music, um, certainly music as a career was not at all on any radar, and my whole sort of the majority of my musical interest just sort of went dormant until I was 16, and this was 1991, and it was the 200th anniversary of Mozart's death, and there was this program on the radio called Morning Mozart on the 96.3 classical music station in Ontario, where that I could pick up in Hamilton. And
Mhm.
my parents were old school, and when I was, as soon as I was old enough to get a job, like they made me work on the weekends, save up for school and this sort of thing. So I was driving to my employment at this grocery store in Hamilton, and on the way to the grocery store, I would always listen to this classical music station because I could feel gravity with that music, art music. I had not discovered jazz music at all at this point, and they played this symphony by Mozart, which I wish I could remember. Um, but all what I do remember is that the architecture of design in that work seemed to visualize as I was driving the car, and I was like, "What is this?" I could sense the perfection of the structure and the polyphony and the harmonic movement, and it was thrilling. So I had to, like, in a sense, I was sort of, the musical intrigue was the switch was flipped, instantly. So
Okay.
like the next day, I went to the Hamilton Public Library with these like plastic grocery bags, and when they used to be free, and I went to the Hamilton Public Library and took out like any score that they had of Mozart's music to the point where my plastic bags were like stretched, and because I had to find out how do you make something like that. It's amazing, and that really introduced what I think was um, a doorway into creative music making, and a doorway into art music. And certainly it began, my a personal search towards, some kind of musical knowledge, some kind of musical truth.
Mhm.
And so at this point, I was, I know I didn't have teachers or anything to study with. I certainly didn't have the cash for that. And I think I'm sort of by nature as I prefer the self-learning method, as difficult as it is. So naturally, I just try to analyze these scores myself and, try to build a theory to explain how they work. Around the same time, though, I was in high school and I was taking the band program. And my band director, who happened to be a jazz guitarist, he went through Mohawk College, I think in the 70s,
Mm.
and he could see that I was curious. So he's like, if you like composing, you should check out jazz music because you improvise. I think it was the first time I considered that music could be improvised. You should check out jazz music because you improvise, and that's like composing on the spot. And because he had studied jazz guitar, he could sort of, I remember one day after school, he was like explaining some chord scale theories and just some real basic fundamentals about how at the time people understood how jazz music worked.
Mm.
And so then that became sort of a secondary pursuit, was this creative music where you're composing in real time, which was really attractive to me. And because I was getting on in my teens and the university is approaching, I still have no idea that a future in music is going to happen. And certainly no one in my circle, like my friends or family, I didn't follow this typical path of that would suggest that would be a natural evolution in my
Mhm.
education. So when it was time to apply to university, I did the sensible thing, which was, choose a different major. But then I thought I should just audition for a music program because, like, if I'm going to school, you know, I can go to music classes and like get the information rather than trying to deconstruct all this stuff myself. So I applied to some classical programs and to some jazz programs, and because I was so basic but probably keen, and I had good marks in high school, which helped the portfolio of what I was presenting, and jazz programs were the ones that opened the door to me because they're like, you don't really need, you've missed a large gap of your musical upbringing because you weren't playing, but like you have enough technique, you have enough knowledge, and you're keen, and we like what you've done, that you figured out all on your own. So the University of Toronto was my choice for going to study, and that was the best, because I spent these 4 years, and coming from a, let's say, slightly economically but certainly culturally impoverished background, to go into an environment where you're with peers who are curious about music as I was, and you go to classes and they just like give you the information that you need. Like, this is the best thing ever, and I can practice on an instrument, and my sister's not going to be yelling at me to get off the piano. Like, I can actually work in peace. So I just went like crazy in my undergrad, where I was like literally putting in 3 times the amount of hours that probably a normal student would, just because it was, I was hungry, and for the first time I had the resources. So I sort of think, in the 4-year undergraduate degree that I took, I kind of learned about 12 years worth of, music learning because of the amount of intensity and time that I was investing in my studies. So
Mhm.
naturally, after progressing quite a lot in a short amount of time, my teachers started hiring me for work, and for one, I guess I was playing fine, and the other, they saw that I went from basically very little to being capable of something that they thought could contribute to their bands that they were playing in, which I was, obviously very touched that they would invite me, and that, so I never had any need, I felt, to do a master's degree formally, but I did know that since I was I found a way to work efficiently in my own music learning that I shouldn't let my graduation somehow be this symbolic ending of my learning. I should just keep going, because it's working, So after my undergrad, I was starting to play professionally with good players, and while in all of my free time, I was studying on my own and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good rhythm of performing a lot. And this was like the late 90s, early 2000s, when at that time in sort of the Toronto, Southern Ontario region, there was quite a lot of work if you had a car, So I saved up and I bought like a car so that I could drive to all the, Kitchener, Waterloo, London, Toronto, Kingston, Hamilton, Guelph. So, and in those days, I was playing 5, 6 nights a week, making, kind of a living. But where I think I transitioned, let's say, out of a purely education and experience way of living post school,
Mm-hmm.
was when I formed my first band, which was this sextet, which I formed in 2001. And basically, I called all the senior people in Toronto who were hiring me and being supportive. And I said, well, I want to form a band and I want you to play in it and we're going to play my music. And that sextet was the first one that I brought to Harvest Jazz and Blues, which is probably where we first crossed paths. And and that really was the beginning of, the rest of my musical career in the sense of, defining a sort of ensemble and putting a strong emphasis on composing for that ensemble and concertizing with that ensemble, and then letting the repertoire evolve until I feel like I've exhausted my options, and then move forward with the next project.
Okay. So that says a lot. Now, the whole cusp of me reaching out to you was because I was intrigued by the album, Nimmons and Braid Falling Through.
Thank you for mentioning that.
The When did you guys start the album? I mean, you compose. The majority of times, you're the one that actually sets the track down and has a path going down a certain series of events. But when did you guys start actually putting the music together?
Well, that album is completely improvised.
Okay.
So, and the story with Phil is really interesting in the sense of I don't think I'll ever have a musical partnership like that because it was so unique. Phil and I never played together, although when I first met him, I had a very strong feeling that I had some future role to play in his musical life. So I just assumed that maybe one day he would hire me to play in his quartet or something. But it was never that. Um, 20 years ago, this November, almost to this day,
Uh-huh.
I got hired by someone in Dundas, Ontario, to play a duo concert. And I thought of Phil. And so I phoned Phil up and I said, do you want to come and play this duo concert? And it just felt, for me, it felt like the right thing to do. It's like I was supposed to do it, And he said, sure. And I was so touched. Phil was a teacher of mine at U of T from just a few years before that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, me being, in those days, very studious. So I, listened to all his recordings. I learned some of his originals. I studied the standards that he liked to play, and I studied the chords that he liked to hear on the standards. So I was like ready for him, And I was really polite. I didn't want to ask him what he wanted to play. I just wanted him to, challenge me, and then I would be ready for the challenge. Because for some reason, I just felt like I had to be there for him in some capacity, musically speaking. So we get to the venue, and he's still not talking about repertoire, And like literally just before we go on stage, I'm like, what's the first tune? And he says, to hell with it, let's just improvise. And yeah, so, to the astonishment of everyone who thought like they were coming to hear, Phil's tunes and standards, um, he just improvised the entire concert. And he had the foresight to bring a good recording device and a good stereo microphone, and we recorded it. And that album is called Beginnings, and literally the first note of the first track is the very first time we sat and played together. And it's the same thing from beginning to end. It's completely improvised. And I remember like us feeling immediately on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
And he phoned me up the next day and he said, from this point forward, I just want to play free music, free improvised music with you. That's what I want to do. And then that started our duo, which he called, because he had his band Nimmons and Nine, and then Nimmons and Nine plus Six. So it became Nimmons and Braid, And from that point, and he was 81 at the time. So from 81 to 96, Phil and I played roughly 100 concerts together all over Canada. We did play in Moncton, I think, at a summer chamber music festival around 2005, 2006, I think. That was the only time we came to New Brunswick. Anyways, and if it wasn't for the pandemic, I'm sure that we would have continued playing until he turned 100. Because our last concert that we did, he was totally fine, like mobility was, tricky, but as soon as he sat down to play, it was like age and the age gap between us completely disappeared. So the recording that you mentioned was the last concert of a cross Canada tour that we did, where we went from, basically Yukon, so from Whitehorse down to Victoria, and then right across to Newfoundland. And we played twice in Newfoundland, and it was always a wonderful place to play. Like in I think, yeah, it must have been 2005, 2006. My two favorite places to play in Canada are Newfoundland and New Brunswick. And it's always, there's just a spirit in the way people take in art music, and it just makes it easy because you feel like you're talking to the audience, because they're expressing themselves in the way that they listen and the way that they clap, and it's a special thing, and so that similar feeling of being really connected with the audience for a second time happened in Newfoundland in this concert, which was 2010. And thankfully, in those days, CBC was picking up concerts, and they had this, remote truck that could come in, a great engineer, Glenn Tilley, who recorded a lot of jazz going through St. John's. He was able to come and record it. And that recording that we made, the titles were Glenn Tilley's, imagination as he was listening. And that concert was Phil and I's, that was our favorite, and we listened to it for years, and we would just, once in a while call each other on the phone to say, I listened to it again, it's still great, And we were, to be honest, we were sort of disappointed that no one really paid attention to it, because when you think about it, like, he's 87 playing with that kind of passion, and and it's completely improvised, but it's organized because it's two composers, but also there's this mentor-mentee relationship, but also, it has that, I had that kind of reverence to him because he was a former teacher and because he's Phil Nimmons. At the same time, like, the generations need each other, so he needed a special kind of support, which I could provide, So it's a really interesting musical and social intergenerational thing that happened, and I think it really manifested in the best possible way in every piece in that concert, And I remember, like, I knew at that time that recording, that concert was particularly special, so I'm super happy that it was recorded, that we can, so I'm, Phil's passed, of course, earlier this year, and I'm sure he's, um, like he'd be thrilled to know that like you listened to it and wanted to chat about it, because we've been sort of waiting for someone to pay attention to it, because we've really enjoyed listening to it years later so much.
Yeah, no, for those that are listening, it's 7 songs, 40 minutes long, and it was dropped officially October 21st, 2024. And it's got that feeling. I'm trying to. While listening to it, the first thing that came to mind was a seaside kind of outlook in regards to the waves, the tides, and the life around it. Um, the fact that you actually did this with Phil was quite interesting, because I had to listen to it at least 5 times to actually get the full gist.
Wow.
But I picked, I think it was "It Won't Always" or "Sirens on Parade" that I decided to play on air,
Okay.
and it was well received. No one complained. So the when you decided to do this creation is from multiple recordings, and you just decided to load them onto a CD. Is that correct?
No, that's all the tracks there are from that one Newfoundland concert,
Okay.
which I remastered, and it was released. Well, CBC played it on, I think it was called The Signal, like in
Okay.
2011. I think they played the whole thing, and then we licensed it from CBC to put it out, and then like the music distributor changed, and then it came down, and then when Phil passed, it brought me back to that recording again, and I thought, oh, I should remaster it and put it back out again, because I know that was so meaningful to him. So that's why the date that you see is 2024, because that's the remastered version after it had been down for 4 or 5 years.
That's okay. At least the fact that you brought it back out means that I discovered it, as well as many other jazz aficionados that enjoy your music and Phil's.
Thank you.
So um, that's quite a journey. Um, the, the 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 next question that I'd like to ask you is, as a composer, okay, because that's basically where your nucleus started, and then you went on to becoming a piano player, quite virtuous one too. How difficult how difficult is it for you to compose and to sell the idea to someone that you want them to play it?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. It's How difficult is it? Well, if it's strangers who don't know me at all, it's very difficult, because I don't write in the typical way, either in the jazz format or in the classical format. And it's always the same story. Like on the jazz side, um, well, on the jazz side now, I think most of the people that I'm working with, or will work, or have worked with for the first time, are already familiar somewhat with my work. So I
Mhm.
haven't had the experience of, you know, sort of feeling like I'm twisting people's arms to learn the music. And when I used to do that, it was the same thing where it was sort of difficult, and well, I can give a good example, a concrete example. So when I was running my sextet, I wrote detailed music for that band, and we had these 6 night a week gigs at the top of the Senator in Toronto once a year, which was my opportunity to like build a whole new repertoire of music. And I recorded a couple of albums out of that, live at the top of the Senator. And it was the same thing. I'd have a rehearsal, and I could tell no one really wants to be there. And then we play the Tuesday night, and it's like, oh, so many mistakes. And a Wednesday Wednesday, so many mistakes. But then Thursday, it started to come together, and then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday was electrifying. And they'd be like, "Oh man, this is great stuff! Like, keep going, keep writing." It's like, why can't you just do that at the rehearsal? Like, come on, man. But they're older than me, so I'm just okay, whatever. I'll just take it on the chin because I'm the young guy. So that, fortunately, on the jazz side, for example, in December, I'm going out to Vancouver to play a couple of nights, and I'm playing for the first time with a couple of musicians that I hadn't met before personally, and so I'm like, oh, we're gonna do like this original music, and they're like, don't worry, like we're happy to do it, like I love your stuff, and so fortunately on the jazz side, it's okay. Now on the classical side, it's kind of a different story, and it's interesting that we're talking about this because tomorrow I'm off to Winnipeg, and I've written this violin concerto, and so here I will be going into this, established, classical ensemble, and they know that I'm coming from a jazz background. So there's already like, I'm sure, well, with them, it's probably going to be fine, but I notice an element of skepticism, and often what happens with my classical music, no one looks at it because, oh, it's jazz, it's going to be easy, we're just going to play whole notes, all night, and but I don't write like that. Never. So on the classical side, I've often come up with the same type of thing that I used to have with my early jazz writing, where the musicians realize that there's more there that's a little bit outside of their experience, which to the among the really great chamber musicians that I've worked with, they love it because they're like, I love playing your stuff because I thought I knew everything and now I'm learning new things again. And that's the greatest compliment that I've had from working with chamber musicians who are very experienced. On the other side, people look at it, so on the page, oh, I can wiggle my fingers and do this, it'll be fine. And then they have trouble with it because some of the foundational language, I think specifically through rhythm and meter and articulation, is not in line with their performance practice, and they have to adjust, to make the music work. So, for example, a comment I got recently about one of my pieces was, it looks so easy on the page, but it's actually deceptively difficult, Having said that, when the musicians commit, I have the same experience where they're thrilled to do something new again. So, for example, last week I was in Prague recording my second concerto. This one's written for tenor saxophone, and I'm using some of the language of contemporary tenor jazz saxophone in an orchestra piece, which I think is a natural fit because the tenor saxophone has this huge tradition of virtuosity and harmonic brilliance and technical brilliance, of course, and sound and melodic and rhythmical. It's just so versatile. To me, it's just as deserving as the violin and piano as an appropriate instrument for a concerto. So a colleague and great saxophone player friend of mine, Mark DeYoung in Calgary, commissioned me to write this piece. But with this Czech orchestra, I've worked with them for 10 years now. So now the relationship is, they trust me, So they, they show up enthusiastic about wanting to play my work, except for the few people who haven't met me before. And it's like, oh, who's this? What would a Canadian do, And but fortunately, because hopefully I'm doing my homework and it's the quality is there in the writing. We're all happy and enthusiastic with the results. So to sum it up, when it's people I don't know at all who don't know my music, because I'm writing more detailed stuff, it's difficult or impossible to sell them on the idea of playing it. They just have to play it, and then they find out, melody is important, harmony is important in this person's writing, narrative is important, and there's a dramatic element in the music which has an emotional manifestation which they enjoy, and I think I'm writing well for the instrument. instruments, so they, get to enjoy their own technical expertise or put that on display. So that's a way for them to express themselves. So only getting them to play it, and sometimes play it more than once, has been the only way that I've found to sell my work. And I'm very happy and lucky and honored to say that I think that's been 100% of my experience, where after they've gotten to know it, then I feel like I've got the musicians sold on it and they're completely behind me and on my side. Thankfully. Hopefully that doesn't change tomorrow when I go to Winnipeg. So
I don't think so. My experience on observing you from afar has been um, quite entertaining, for the fact that I'm glad that seeing you have successes and acclamation that's very much deserved, by the way. Um, the Out of all the elements that you've been playing with, I'm completely frazzled by the fact that you actually went to classical at one point, but it makes sense. When you decided to go into jazz or to do jazz, I still remember the can't remember the name. I think it's the Workers song.
oh, the work song? Oh yeah. One of
Yeah,
my
you
hits.
did. You redid it a second time, and the second time was epic. It was 9 minutes long, and it was well played. You could follow it through from the beginning of the workday to the end of it, and the interstices that happen during lunch and dinner. So, but out of the stylings that you've played, do you enjoy composing an actual song instead of going into improvisation?
I enjoyed both, actually. I think, though, my number one priority when I'm playing or writing, or let's just say my number one priority as a creative musician, be
Hmm.
it composing jazz, composing classical, performing jazz, my number one priority is communication with the listener. And um, which I think is fundamental to artistic expression, musical expression. I heard this interesting, um, I think it was a lecture or maybe it was an interview, I can't remember, where this neurologist was saying that the area of the brain that's active listening to music is older in evolutionary history than the area of the brain that's responsible for language. And then he referenced some first contact in the early 20th century with, Aboriginal people who had no contact with the outside world. So essentially, they were looking in at the Stone Age, and in more than one instance, song and melody was used as a way to communicate. This water is safe to drink. Don't go there. Like, it was used as, like, music was actually used as language, supporting this hypothesis. And why am I mentioning that? I think in the 20th century, with a lot of experimentation in um, in art music, where, well, I'll just go out and say I have this bizarre thought experiment for anyone who's an intellectual. Like, go ahead and, like, destroy me for saying this, but this is my weird thought experiment. I'm
Hmm.
just going to say it for the first time in this interview. Um, I have this idea that, in the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche announces God is dead. Okay, now what he actually meant, and maybe how that echoed in popular culture, um, is probably not the same thing. But I kept thinking about this idea that if, just speaking in a metaphorical level, if God is dead, then, like, and and what substitutes the natural inclination towards, the ultimate organizer of creation, and I thought, did this create the precondition for, let that idea trickle down in education a couple of decades? Did that create the precondition for the harmonic series to be thrown out. And what, because I was thinking the harmonic series, like, and this is why I have this supreme respect for tonality. And interestingly, only the West, who announced God is Dead, is the only musical system that threw out tonality. I think that's also interesting. No other culture announced that their religious figurehead is dead, and all, as far as I know, all other musical systems have never dissolved tonality. So where I'm getting at is the harmonic series, for example, is responsible for tonality, and like, the sound of my voice and your voice, the sound of a saxophone, the sound of a flute is unique because of the quality of the timbre with respect to the harmonic series. Like, you can't pretend that the harmonic series is not real. Like, it's in every sound. It's the essence of sound itself and the uniqueness of sound itself. So in a sense, it's kind of like the God metaphor manifests in the harmonic series. And I thought, well, if God is dead, the harmonic series is old-fashioned, what's left? Well, then, man steps in and says, well, I'll just build my own system, thank you very much. And then I wonder, with all this experimentation in the 20th century and 21st century, where the composer becomes for lack of a better term, the God, then is that responsible for lessening the ability for the music to speak to or create community or create community with the listener? I don't know. This is just a kind of thought experiment. However, it motivates me in my work to not accept that it's okay to leave your audience in the dark and do whatever you want on stage. And I know musicians disagree on this point, and that's fine. Having said that, I also think it's a mistake to, purposely try and reach your audience in a way that they expect just for the sake of making a connection, Mm-hmm. And so I think there's somewhere in between where you're connecting with the audience, but you're giving them something beautiful and unexpected, and that that makes an impact on them in some way, and it forms a relationship between, let's say, the listener and the maker, and so to finally close the question, that forming that relationship where I'm trying to present something unexpected and hopefully beautiful and relevant, that's my number one priority. And I'll spend my whole life trying to refine my skills so that I can do that in the most efficient way, no matter what style of music and no matter what format I'm delivering it in.
That brings me to a question about you, because you're not the piano, you're not the script, you're not anything. You're the man who creates it. But as a human being, do you have any hobbies? Other than composing and dabbling on the piano?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. What I've okay, so in more recent years, because as I said earlier, I worked really hard at the beginning because I felt like I had to catch up for lost time. But in more recent years, I've found that the proclivity to creativity has now, found ways to manifest in other outlets, so probably no surprise. I love cooking. I cook every day, and I try and learn about cooking methods, and I take it seriously, in a sense of with the same sort of hopefully honesty and earnestness as I do learning music still. Also, I'm quite interested and now sort of experienced in design. So the place that I'm in Toronto is, I think, my third place that I designed, like from top to bottom. And during the pandemic, when I couldn't work in music because all gigs were off,
Yeah.
A contractor who I hired to build the place in Toronto that I designed, he hired me to do some design work for him because he knew I wasn't working. And then a colleague of mine, a classmate and great saxophone player, had also bought a house during the pandemic, and it needed a lot of work, and so I ended up designing his place. And I think I've done 5 or 6 homes now, and it's in a different life. I probably would enjoy being an architect, but with the same motivation as just allowing structure to communicate with the inhabitants. It's the same sort of motivation,
Wow.
but I definitely actually an architect professor came for dinner here once, and he didn't know that I did the design of my place. And the first thing he looked at was I have a fascination with bookshelves, which I've designed and built a bunch of bookshelves, and staircases. These are the two things I'm really fascinated with. So the first thing he noticed, who designed the staircase? And it was like it was a certain curve that I put in the landing, which captured his attention. And then I explained that actually the whole place was, I literally drew it all out on graph paper because I couldn't figure out how to use the software. And so we had this long discussion about, because he was really curious, how did you take musical knowledge and convert that into this, in design and build. So I think at one point we had an idea that I was going to go in and speak to his architecture class, but I don't think it ended up happening. So cooking, design and build, certainly I feel like the skills that I've learned as a musician and composer easily find their way into these other outlets. I mean, I also, even though it's not so great for my hands, I do enjoy sports. I don't play any physical sports these days, but my father was really disappointed that I decided to pursue music because I think he really wanted me to be a professional golfer. So I golfed a lot when I was a kid, and recently I've sort of gone back to it.
Okay.
I have a golf royalty in my genes. There's a James Braid. He won the British Open a bunch of times around the turn of into the 20th century. So I probably have some of that performer gene that I use for music. Maybe some of it comes from him too. I don't know, but yeah. But having said that, I mean, I still work extremely hard, trying to keep up musically with continual learning and also with commissions and preparing for concerts. So,
Okay.
I feel pretty lucky that I can do some small things on the side, but everything that all falls away when I have to buckle down and get to some music work.
Oh, okay. So I can't believe that you actually did designs. You'd go along great in my household where we're always looking for better ideas for
Oh yeah.
bookshelves.
Cool. Well, next time I'm out there, I'll come by.
The last question I have for you is uh, it's quite to the point because it ties in with what you said that you enjoy cooking. What's your favorite food dish?
Good question. Well, I have to say that it's always changing because it's always based on a new cooking method, you know. So I have to think, what am I cooking recently that I really enjoy? Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, because it's literally the thing that I've been doing in the last few weeks,
Okay.
um, and it's really, really simple. So if anyone's listening who's a cook, like, you're welcome. Like, it's delicious and it's super simple. So lately I've been buying like whole fish, like sea bass or sea bream or something, like a good quality whitefish.
Mhm.
Now I'm thinking about food. Now I have like, all these dishes I want to talk about. So what I've been doing is just steaming this fish. I think it's actually a Chinese method. Steaming the fish and then simply making a sort of uh, sauce like thing. Just simply half 1 part soy sauce, 1 part water. I usually put sesame oil and a bit of chili, and then I pour that over the steamed fish, and then I cover it with fresh coriander,
Mhm.
and then I heat up. This is sort of the best part. I heat up, some high heat oil, and then I pour that over the whole thing so it sort of hits and sizzles, and it's really, I mean, you can cook it in like 15 minutes. It takes 8 minutes to cook a small fish, to steam a small fish, and the sauce, like that prep is, 3 minutes. So this is my favorite dish these days because I'm working on a new piece, and so my cooking time is sort of limited. But having said that, I'm also super into making soups. So I'm always experimenting with broth of different varieties. And so I think probably my favorite area of cooking is probably soup making.
That makes sense. That
Mm.
makes sense. Then, folks, this man is everything that you want as a neighbor. So, David, thank you so
Oh, no
much for
problem.
coming to
Thank
this.
you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk.
Oh, you're very much welcome. Till the
Yeah.
next time.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.